What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the third-person tutorial and action RPG tutorial series, we are going to be going over respawning and checkpoints. So, in the previous episode in this series, we were able to die after taking enough damage, but that was it. We just got stuck there, we couldn't do anything. Now we are going to allow our character to be able to respawn, play a little respawn animation, and then resume control and reset all of our values back to the living state. Not too much more to say about this one. It's pretty self-explanatory, just being able to respawn or at least relocate our character and reset their default values so that we can control them again. That is, of course, super important for our game so that we don't just die one time and then get stuck forever. Before we get into this episode, I just want to give a huge thank you to the YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you for everything you've done. I'm so grateful and so excited to keep working on this series with you. Thanks again. Now, if you would like to get caught up in the series and check out everything we've done to this point, you can go ahead and click this icon in the top right corner right here. You'll see how we created our inventory, how we're able to attack with our weapons, do different damage and stats. Alternatively, if you don't care about that, but you only care about implementing the respawning system, then I would recommend you watch this episode first. This is the previous episode in the series, which is the dying episode. It's not required because you may have your own method of dying already. But we are going to expand upon a few of the things we set up in that episode, so I would recommend watching it so that you can be fully caught up and prepared to do this one. We can go ahead and get started. All of our logic today is going to be in our code, so I recommend going to the code and going to the third-person tutorial character.h. When we die, there are a few things that we need to know for how our respawn system is going to work. So there are different types of respawns in games, and sometimes there's even different types of respawns in the same game, depending on the reason of death or where you are. So if you're in story mode or if you're in multiplayer, that could also affect it. And so the first method we're going to be showing off today is the standard, you have died, we're going to teleport you back to your last checkpoint or some sort of safe location, and then respawn the character. There are, of course, other methods, such as loading the game and causing them to respawn. So after death, they have to fully load and reset all the enemies, all the items back to the default state. We will be covering that, but that will be something that we cover in a saving and loading episode. It won't be tied directly to our respawn. So that's for later in the series. And then the other case that I always like to think of is the respawning in multiplayer. So if we're defeated, we may have to select a random spawn point and spawn there, and then continue about our day. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to manually set our spawn point, teleport back to that location, and then reset all of our default values and allow the player to control the character again. So in the third-person tutorial character, I'm going to scroll down to my variables. And there's a few variables we want to make here. So scrolling down to the bottom, I've made a variable that is an F vector called spawn location. And it is the location of the last checkpoint or spawn location. I guess I should rename this to point. The location of the last checkpoint or spawn point. That might make it a little bit easier to understand. But basically, we're going to set this when we initially spawn the character. And then if we reach certain points while going about the level that we want the character to be able to spawn back at if they die, we will update this variable. So essentially, this is just the location in the world that we are going to manually spawn the character at. This can work for the first spawn location or any respawns. F vector is basically 3 floats. You'll see that when we use it, but if you're not familiar, this is just 3 values, an X, Y, and a Z, all to capture the location that we need. I have made it a U property, edit anywhere, blueprint read write with a category of spawn. This means that we can access it and edit it in the blueprint if needed. This could be particularly useful if you're setting up your spawn points on each individual map or stage, and you want to make sure that you can set this variable appropriately based on those player starts or spawn locations. Additionally to that, we need to make sure that we can respawn our character after a given period of time. In this case, what I'm actually going to do is set a timer once we die. Once that timer runs out, then we know we can respawn the character. So we need a float value to determine how long or how many seconds the character has after dying before they can respawn. And we need a timer handle to actually keep track of this It will let us know when it's finished, or if we pause the game, it can actually pause the timer for us as well. So timer handle and a float for the duration until respawn. So scrolling back to my floats here, I have a respawn delay variable. And that is the time after death that is required to wait until the character will respawn. Float respawn delay. And I've given it a U property of edit anywhere blueprint read write category of health. So it's the same as the spawn location except the category. Basically, if we ever need to access this value in a blueprint, we can. We won't for today's purposes, so you can feel free to skip the U property for now, as we don't actually need it. But I think it would be very useful in the future, especially in a multiplayer scenario. We may want to know how much time is remaining on the respawn timer. And so we can pass this along to our HUD, and then the players will be able to see how much time they have. Lastly, like I said, we need our timer handle. So I'm scrolling down to the bottom, and I have a respawn timer handle here. Timer handles essentially just interact with the timer system in Unreal. So this timer handle will allow us to pause the timer, start the timer, set how long the timer is going to run for, determine what happens once the duration, or in our case the respawn delay, runs out. We have a lot of freedom with what we can do with these timers, but the timer handle is what kind of contains all that data and keeps track of it for us, so we know exactly where our timer is at and what's going to happen when it is finished. We already use something like this for the stamina recharge. Basically, after not using stamina for a long enough period of time, we were recharging our stamina bar, and this is similar. We're going to start this timer when the character dies, and once this timer handle notifies us that it has completed, it will call the respawn function and will respawn the character. You'll notice I don't have this one as U property, it's just F timer handle, respawn timer handle. It's because we don't need it in the blueprint. A lot of these timers that we use in the code won't be needed in blueprints, so I typically ignore them and just do everything related to them in the code. That's good for all of our variables. We do need a function as well, and that is the respawn function. We do have a die function from the previous episode, but we need to determine what happens when we actually want to respawn the character as well, so that should be a separate function. So scrolling up to my functions, I put the respawn function right under the die function, because that makes logical sense. So respawn the character, void respawn. Simple enough. Doesn't take in any parameters right now or anything like that. There is one more thing I actually want to do in here as well, and that is to override the begin play function. So if we scroll down to where our functions are, I went to where my constructor was in the third person tutorial character.h, and one line under that, I went ahead and overrode the begin play function for the character class. So remember that third person tutorial character is a child of the character class. The character class has our begin play function. And you've seen this in Blueprint a lot, because when the character spawns and begin play is called, that's essentially when we can construct all of our data, we can set all of our default values. The reason I want to override begin play today is because when setting our spawn location, that variable that we created earlier in this episode, I want to spawn the character and then initially set the spawn location, so even if they don't reach a checkpoint or another point where we change the spawn location variable, they don't spawn outside of the map. We know that this initial spawn that they have is a valid spawn point, and so setting our spawn location to that value is not a bad idea. However, the constructor is actually too early to set that value. The constructor is what fires immediately upon creating this class, so when the class is created, before its location is actually set, all of its variables will have the default value. So the spawn location would be 0, 0, 0 for X, Y, and Z. However, looking again at this character, you can see that I have just brought them into the scene. This is actually from the third-person tutorial template. And you can see that the location on this actor is not 0, 0, 0. It's negative 990, 220, and 261.002. Now, you could move everything to revolve around 0, 0, 0, and that would fix your issue automatically. Maybe you don't want the character to spawn at 0, 0, 0. Maybe you don't want to have that reliance. So a very easy thing to do is know that once begin play is called, the character will already be moved to the appropriate spot that they were set to in the level. Thus, if we try and grab the current location of the character to set the spawn location and begin play, that will work. Won't work in the constructor because they haven't been moved to that location yet, but it will work in begin play. So to override begin play, you can override it like any other function. You just put virtual, then the name of the function. Void begin play is the function, the character class that we're trying to override, with the keyword override here. Now once you do that, you just have to set it up in the third person tutorial character.cpp and you're good to go. You don't have to change anything else about it. So now it's time that we go to that third person tutorial character.cpp, and we will start in the constructor because we want to set all of our default values for the variables that we created. Scrolling down, I have my respawn delay that I've set to 3.0, which is 3 seconds. So after dying, it takes 3 seconds until we respawn. I've also set the spawn location to an F vector of 0.0, 0.0, and 0.0. Basically just the default location in the world. However, we are going to update it in begin play, as I said, so don't worry too much about this. I am still in the habit of setting all my variables to default when possible, so that's why you see me do this here. Now, we actually don't have to set the timer handles, though, as they are objects within Unreal that are already handled. They already are constructed when we create them. They're used properly and managed properly by Unreal. So I don't typically do anything with them in the constructor because it is just not necessary. Now below the constructor, I added the begin play function. Now when you're adding a function that you've overrode in the .h file, you don't have to write virtual, you don't have to write override. So it's as simple as void, the name of my class, : begin play. Now this function is super simple. The initial line that I have here is super : begin play, which basically just means I'm going to call the parent classes begin play. This is important because the A character begin play has a lot of good stuff in it, a lot of things that are required for our movement and listeners, for our inputs. Typically, when you play the game, you don't notice that any of that is being handled by a character. It's just there, it just works. But when we override a function, if we don't put super begin play, we can fully fill out our own logic for that function. And so if this isn't here, we don't do anything in character begin play. So we lose out on all that logic. So we want to make sure that we still do all that logic that is in the characters begin play. But then additionally, we're going to add our own logic. And now we're going to set our spawn location to the actor's location. Again, in begin play, the current location that they are will be the location that they were moved to in the level. So this will set the spawn location to the values that you see in here. So spawn location equals get actor location. And that's all we need for begin play. Now we can scroll down quite a bit. We can scroll all the way down to our die function, which is right here. Now everything that you see highlighted here was already in our die function. There's only one line that we really need to add today, and that is our timer. So we can set up our timer and then call the respawn function after the respawn delay. To do this, we need to actually create the respawn function here. So go right below your die function and create the respawn function. After creating the respawn function, I'll explain everything that's inside of it. So the first thing we want to do when we respawn the character is set the actor's location back to the spawn location. This will take the character from wherever they are at currently and move them back to the previous location that we said is good for them to spawn in, or is safe for them to spawn in. Set actor location only requires an F vector. There are other things you can add in there, some optional parameters. But for right now, all we need is the spawn location. Once they've respawned, I've also set is dead to be false. They're no longer dead because they're respawning, so we're just disabling that. And then I go ahead and set any values back that I need. So specifically, player health and player armor, I'm setting back to their default value of 100% or 1.0. And this allows their health bar and shield bar to fill back up. You could also reset their stamina here. Not a bad idea. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. current stamina equals max stamina. This will also reset our stamina to the highest value that we have on that character, so just a clean slate. And you'll notice there may be a lot of things we want to do in the respawn that I haven't covered. So if you have any other additional things you want to set back to their default state, make sure you do that. For example, you could set your movement state. This case, it's not really required because that will happen when we respawn, but you could set your movement state back to movement state idle, for example. You have a lot of options, a lot of freedom in here. So if you see any bugs with things not being reset, just add them to the respawn function, resetting their value, and that should fix that issue. Once we've made the respawn function, we can actually call it, and again, we're going to do this through a timer. So going back to the die function here, in this last line, we have get world get timer manager dot set timer. This is a function that Unreal has. The world is the world, quite literally in this case. So as far as Unreal goes, the world is just the parent object to the level and all the data that it has within it. The world has a timer manager on it. So we can use the world to get the timer manager, and then the timer manager has a set timer function, which is what actually starts the timer. In set timer, we have to pass in quite a few parameters here. So let's go over all those parameters. So set timer. First of all, you need to pass in a timer handle. That is the respawn timer handle that we made earlier in the episode. Then you need to determine what object this timer is going to run on. And we want to do it on this because this character is the one that is respawning. So this just stands for this actual object. Next, you need the function that is going to be called when the timer finishes. In that case, we're going to call our respawn function. You can call a different class's function here. It doesn't have to be the same class as this object. And so that's why you see it like this. We have an ampersand here. A third-person tutorial character, : respawn. We're referencing this function from the timer manager, not from this class. So it has to be able to call this function. That's why we write it out like that. This is the time it will take for this timer to finish, and that is our respawn delay variable that we made earlier in the episode. The last parameter here is if we should repeat the timer. So once the timer finishes, should it start back at 0? We don't want to do that for the case of dying and respawning. Alright, now we are actually good to go with the code. So we are going to go into the engine, into our animation blueprint. This is where we have all of our animations. And we had an idle to death animation when is dead was true. I've now added a new state called respawn. So right click, add state. When you're in the state machine of your AnimBP, call this one respawn. And I have a new animation in my game that looks like this. This is my respawn animation. So he's kind of waking up after being knocked out or dead or whatever it was. So plug your animation in. Make sure your respawn animation does not loop. We don't want to keep playing it. We only want to play it the one time. And to go from death or dead to respawn, I just checked to see that we're not dead anymore. I don't have anything else in here. You can look at my events. They're all none. Don't worry about that. We only care about the transition rule. And I just make sure that my character reference is dead boolean, not. Then we can enter this transition. Now remember, in the code, we had set is dead to false when we respawned. As soon as is dead is false, after they are moved, they will be able to go into the respawn function and play that animation that you see. Now, from there, there's only one other place to go, and it should return to idle so that the character can be controlled again once they respawned. To do that, I actually have an automatic transition rule. So you'll notice I have nothing in my transition rule. But if you click on the transition, you can select this option, automatic rule based on sequence, player, and state. And that means once this animation is complete, if no other transitions can be taken, it will automatically take this one. So basically, once the respawn animation is finished, return to idle. You'll notice nothing else is changed in this transition rule either. And there you go. Now we'll go to dead, and we'll go to respawn. Once we are no longer dead, that's how we respawn. Then we'll return to idle, and from there we can actually go to all of our other states just like normal. The only thing you will be able to do that you probably won't want to be able to do is still move and still do things when you're in your respawn animation. So see, when I die, I can't do anything. But when I get teleported back, I can move already. And you probably don't want to be able to do that. Of course, you could add a boolean like is respawning or something to get this to work. But actually, the next episode, we're going to add a boolean called can move. And we're just going to restrict when we can do certain movements the same way we did with is dead if we can't move. But can move will be a lot more important than just for dead or respawning. So we'll go over that. But anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you're excited to be able to respawn. So now you can actually play this like a game. You can die and respawn. Sure, not everything respawns in the level yet, only the character. But it's a good start. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. Does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out again to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys once again for all the love. So grateful for you, and so excited to keep working on this series. If you had any issues while watching this episode or any of my episodes, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.